This was the world in which Armstrong discovered his musical genius, and conversely, it was his genius that propelled him into this larger world and forced him to negotiate it. He was too good to linger his life away on the black side of apartheid. Talent gave him a life on the white side, too. How to handle it? Louis Armstrong adapted a mask that came out of the black minstrel tradition. It was certainly not as sycophantic and self-demeaning as the blackface caricatures of the actual minstrel shows. Still, it did the one thing it had to do. It communicated to white audiences that Louis Armstrong would entertain them, but not presume to be their equal. The relentlessly beaming smile, the handkerchief dabbing away the sweat, the reflexive bowing, the exaggerated humility and graciousness, all this signaled that he would not breach the manners of segregation, the propriety that required him to be both cheerful and less than fully human. In other words, Armstrong's mask was a small offering of black inferiority. It was something he had to give to whites, at least a slight concurrence with their mythology of white supremacy and black inferiority. It also amounted to a gift of innocence to whites, because it said that their racism was not prejudice, but truth, a truth he himself observed. And this little gift of innocence, this slight homage to whiteness, was a part of the show. It helped white people in a segregated society enjoy themselves without guilt, and it enabled them to cherish Louis Armstrong. For the oppressed, and even for those who simply belong to minority groups, masking is always an attempt to offset the power differential that so favors those born to the mainstream. Armstrong's mask allowed him to exercise power in a society bent on keeping power away from his kind. It helped him offset the power differential with whites by giving him a livelihood in the broad American mainstream that he was not meant to have. Bing Crosby, to the mainstream born, did not have to wear a mask of racial self-effacement in order to win an audience. The masks that blacks wear in American society are always strategic, always based on a reading of what is possible in white America. And so, we blacks are never quite what whites think we are. Our entire history in America is a history of, among other things, masking. Our manipulation of whites requires that we all be on the same page, behind the same mask. Whites have trouble reading blacks because we are always showing them only what we want them to see, always pushing them this way and that. We always have two narratives, what we tell each other and what we tell whites. Miles Davis, the 20th century's greatest jazz trumpeter after Armstrong, often turned his back to his audiences. His surliness was so legendary that fans considered it a badge of honor to have been abused by him. Today, I know an elderly white gentleman who likes to glamour himself by telling the story, almost every time I see him, of being cursed out by Miles Davis at Shelley's Manhole in Los Angeles back in the 60s. I, too, saw Miles play on a few occasions, and was once, also to my great honor, cursed out by him. His mask was that he had no mask, and one of my pleasures at his shows, along with his music, was simply looking at him. His face was so without effect that it could be described as existential. My joke was that Sartre could have photographed him and been done with it. And yet, it was a mask. Maybe not so far removed from the actual man as Armstrong's mask, but a mask nevertheless. Miles emerged in a more prosperous post-war America that was building toward the civil rights victories of the 60s. President Truman had integrated the military, the Supreme Court had moved to integrate the schools, and jazz had evolved, to the displeasure of many, from a music to dance by into a modernist art form of deep individual expression. Miles's eminently cool mask communicated two things: that he was an artist rather than an entertainer, and that he was utterly unapologetic as a black. These, then, were the terms of his engagement with the broad American mainstream. In Armstrong's day, Miles could not have turned his back on white audiences or cursed people between sets and survived. He would have had no career. Yet his mask worked in post-war America, and it worked in the same way that Armstrong's mask had worked decades earlier. Miles, too, offered his white audiences the chance for a little innocence. The America of his era, particularly the urban North, was ready for racial change, and there was no better way to show one's racial broad-mindedness and artistic hipness than by going to see a black jazz artist who insulted you a little. If Armstrong helped whites to innocence by going along a bit with white supremacy, Miles did it by giving whites a chance to see superiority in him. This menacing and subversive black hipster who took white women for granted and drove around Manhattan in a Ferrari. For whites, there was self-flattery in being a fan of either man. Different eras, different masks. And it was Armstrong's fate to live well into the Miles Davis era so that his mask fell out of phase with the times and turned on him. In my youth, in the 50s and 60s, Louis Armstrong was quite unfairly seen by many as an Uncle Tom, while Miles Davis was thought to embody a new, uncompromising militance. In my black neighborhood, we gave Armstrong no credit for having emerged in an era when white supremacy was a totalitarian blanket over black life. We wanted to have the illusion that blacks had never been forced to display this kind of humility. In our protest era, he shamed us, and we often held him up to ridicule. No doubt he suffered greatly from this in his last years. Actually, Armstrong kicked up quite a controversy in the 50s by criticizing the segregationist Arkansas governor Orville Faubus in rougher language than any civil rights leader of that day would have used. He was the first black entertainer to demand, by contract, that he be able to stay in the same hotels he performed in. At some risk to his own career, Armstrong opened some of America's largest hotels to blacks. He was no Uncle Tom. Our mistake, if not our shame, was to confuse the mask with the man. But the maskings of Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis are only personal examples of the masking that we black Americans also do on a collective level. That is, we also have a distinct group mask that we all are expected to wear, if only loosely. And this group mask, like the individual mask, is always strategic, always based on a reading of what is possible for us in broader white America. Our history in America is a history of having to negotiate our fate indirectly through white America. So, to affect our fate, we have always had to manipulate white America, to find the collective face that would best win us advantage with whites.